Welcome, Fred Oesch, to Go Solar Virginia.
Wow.
Thanks for taking the time, Fred. So I wonder if we could start this interview by just giving us a brief review of your growing up, what got you interested in architecture, perhaps engineering if you went that route, and tell us your studies and how it evolved a little bit.
Sure. From a very early age, I think I really started out more as a naturalist or environmentalist when I really could see the damage that humans were doing to our environment and to our planet. And then my forte was kind of in general sense in design. So in kind of putting those two things together, originally I started out designing furniture. And I became a furniture designer and builder, a craftsperson, and eventually that evolved into architecture. So went to any number of different schools in architecture, and finally ended up getting my master's degree from Virginia Tech, and so been really practicing green, sustainable design my entire career, starting in the mid-'70s.
Okay. And I guess one of the things that seems like it's taken a long time for this to kind of percolate into the public mind. There's been a lot of resistance, it seems to me, and maybe you can tell me if that's true. Does it seem to be changing? Is there a little more momentum behind alternative energy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the movement, if you will, has kind of gone through and still is going through some cycling. In the mid-'70s, when we first had the first oil crisis and gasoline prices jumped, and all of a sudden, it affected people's pocketbooks more than it did their sort of environmental awareness. And so from that perspective, everyone started getting into solar and all of that. And then the price of gasoline ended up going down, and so people started losing the interest or the incentive. And then there was kind of a resurgence when, Al Gore and started proclaiming the inconvenient truth, and people started becoming more consciously aware. But then, '08 rolled around, and we had our financial downturn, our crisis, and housing market fell out. And so people then again were, looking back to their pocketbooks. But now I guess that we are on a very slow but seeming financial recovery. And as our climate crisis is becoming all the more relevant, I think the trend is certainly rising right at the moment. So people are becoming increasingly interested in and wanting to build green or retrofit in a green way. Not only because actually ultimately it is a good financial investment, as people are starting to understand, but also it's the right thing to do for our planet. So that's kind of where we are today.
Beautiful. Now, I kind of get the impression that you're a bit of a master of passive solar. Is that accurate?
Yes, I'd say so. Not only passive solar, but also passive cooling.
Okay.
Both, yeah. And in a general sense, passive systems, non-mechanical systems, as much as possible.
Okay. And tell me a little bit about, I saw a picture of this house you built up in Massachusetts. Or no, it was Maine. Was it Maine?
Yes.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about that project, how that came about. And I saw that you'd set it up so that the sun would heat the foundation, and then you could control the release of heat into the house through windows. Was that all the heating you needed? It looked like I saw a chimney as well, so you must have had a fireplace in there. What other forms of heating did you have?
Yeah, there's a number of different elements that all come into play in a case like that, but the basic concept or design of that, and it could apply to essentially any house, is the idea of some kind of a sun space or greenhouse type structure, be on the south, that you can, and that combined with thermal mass, whether that be concrete or masonry of some kind, the idea, and being able to isolate or open that space to the rest of the house. And you can automate that process, or you can also do it manually. So the basic idea is that, the sun comes up, warms the space, the greenhouse, the sun space. You have big French doors, or you can automate it if you want with fans, to where when it gets up to a certain temperature, then it'll blow that warm air, or allow that warm air to come right into the house, and then for all practical purposes, and many days of the year, it will provide almost all of the heat that you would need for the house if it's sized correctly. And then, at night, typically that's where you're going to lose a lot of your heat to the nighttime sky radiation. So that's where you close the doors or shut off the vents, so you isolate and you trap that warm air inside the house. So depending upon your region and time of year, you can go a long way. I'd say provide plus or minus 75% of your heating needs on an annual basis with a system like that. Typically you do need some kind of backup heat in the winter if you have, 10 days in a row that it's all cloudy and you're really not getting that solar gain, whether that's a wood stove or some other form of heat. A lot of times I supplement my houses with hydronic radiant floor heating.
That's the term I was trying to think of. Yes.
Yeah, which is a great. It's really, I think, the ideal type of heating system, and you can supplement that, particularly if it's in a thermal mass like a concrete slab on your floor. It's hot water that you're circulating through there, so it's a system that can never become obsolete, because any method now or in the future that can heat hot water can be tied in and linked to this system. So solar hot water panels on the roof, geothermal. Of course, you can do efficient gas boilers that can be linked to it. So it's really an ideal system, and it provides an evenly distributed heat everywhere. And you can zone it just like you would, like say, a forced hot air system. But it eliminates the need for ducting, which is inherently unhealthy because of the dust, mold, mildew that can build up in them. They're unsightly. You got to box them in. So it really is kind of, wood-fired boiler also can be linked. So it's really kind of, and the Romans, figured this out, millennia ago. So it's kind of a timeless principle that you can use.
Beautiful. Can you describe to me, is this some kind of tubing that is sealed in the concrete? Is it a plastic, or is it some other material?
It's called PEX, PEX, which is short for cross-linked polyethylene, and typically it comes in big long coils, and so you lay it in the concrete slab. You can do it in a wood frame, but it's most efficient in a slab. But from the source point where it's receiving its hot water to the end, there are no joints. There are no connections. So it's pretty foolproof. You don't really have to worry about it leaking, and it's a really kind of an inert material. It's even used for potable water. It's a variation of the type used for hydronics is also available for potable water, and is also, I think, the best method currently available.
Is this most easily done if you're doing a completely new construction, or is it as possible?
It's most easily, but you can do retrofits with it. As an option to having, let's say, tubing in the floor, you can also use conventional hot water, radiators, like the old schoolhouse type, or there are modern, contemporary-looking ones. So that's an option. It still uses the same hot water type system, but instead of having the tubes in the floor, you can have more conventional radiators.
Interesting. Okay. All right. So let's see. let's go through some of these various techniques. Now, let's cover solar at this point. I'm sure you've done some buildings with electric photovoltaics. Tell us how you work those in to your systems. Are those a first choice for you, or are you usually including them because the customer wants them? What's your take on that?
Yeah, PV photovoltaics, I think, is certainly, our future. It is a technology that is evolving very, very quickly right now because there's a tremendous amount of R&D being poured into it. Currently, the investment is pretty pricey, and the efficiency of the panels that we have right now are only around 15 to 20%. So the technology has a long way to go. However, they are coming up with, for example, coatings that you might even apply like paint. Some of which are even some of the more recent ones are even clear, so that you can apply it to window glass or virtually any surface. And of course, they're really focusing on upgrading the efficiency of these systems. So in a very few years, the whole industry is going to be completely upgraded and revolutionized. That's not to say you shouldn't do it now. However, it's likely that if you buy a system right now, it is going to be pretty obsolete within a few years. So the question becomes whether or not, you get your payback in that time frame. But certainly, I'm a very strong advocate of photovoltaics, and as I say, it is the future.
Yeah. Well, I'm surprised to hear you say that you think it's still a few years out, because I think that's kind of been the going line for like 20, 30 years now. And I've been very interested in what's happening with Solar City, how they're offering these solar programs to folks where they essentially pay less than their electric bill and get the system installed, and then they gradually pay the company back as if they were paying an electric bill, but more cheaply. So it must be that PV must be cheap enough to do that, to justify that.
Well, yeah, I'm not advising that you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying that it's going to be a better value as time goes on. The other big factor in photovoltaics is, whether to be on the grid or off the grid. Ideally, I think we would all like to be off the grid, or at least grid tied, certainly. But if we're off the grid, then that means, the weak link still is batteries. However, that technology too is evolving very quickly. Tesla, for example, is coming out with a new battery that should be available on a residential, scale next year or so. Of course, initially its cost is still going to be high, but the battery is currently the weak link. Not only in terms of efficiency, but also in terms of the environmental impact to both manufacture them and also to recycle them. So, for example, let's say you invest $30,000, $40,000 to have a PV system without the batteries. You're grid tied. The good news is that if you generate more power than you're consuming, then yes, in most locales you can sell it back to the power company. Of course, you're selling back at wholesale and you're buying at retail. But let's say you've made that $30,000 and $40,000 investment, and you're grid tied, and the grid goes down. Well, you've had that investment, but you still have no power. So that's where, for my clients who do invest in PV, I recommend that they still do need some kind of small battery bank or some other type of electric backup system in those cases. You can have a small battery array that only powers your vitals, like refrigeration, communications, maybe the pumps for your radiant floor heating system, whatever. So you can have a fairly small battery backup system and make it through those periods of time. So.
Okay. Is that the battery you're referring to at Tesla? Is that the Powerwall that they recently promoted? They've got one for residential and one for commercial use. I'm not sure if it's for sale, but I know they've done a a promotional video on it. They may be actually be taking orders already.
Yeah, I don't know the exact status of it. It's a spin-off of their hybrid car.
Right.
But the same, I mean, similar battery technology. And I don't know the exact state. I don't know if they're actually selling systems yet or not, but they're close, I think.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Tell me a little bit about these living roofs. So what's the advantage of them? One of the things that I know, they're just aesthetically beautiful. I mean, that's one thing. And then I guess you also have this benefit of you're creating oxygen, and sucking up carbon. I'm sure that's a minor thing. But what are some of the benefits? I guess they have a big effect on heating the house, containing heat or containing the, coolness, if you will. Tell us about these roofs.
Yeah, again, most people do find them beautiful. Not everyone, but certainly to me, that's a big virtue. There are different systems, intensive, extensive. The one that I use is the thinner type system that's only about 4 inches thick. And the big advantage of that is that for most structures, even existing structures, they will handle the additional weight without substantial structural upgrading. It's a fairly thin system, a layering system comprised of primary membrane, a wicking layer to provide moisture as the plants start to dry out above, a drainage plane so that it does not become oversaturated. And then we use an engineered soil mix with only about 20% organics. And typically we use either succulents or sedums as a ground cover, which is pretty foolproof. I mean, it'll go through periods of drought and oversaturation and still be very, very healthy. There's also any number of different species that you can plant, so they bloom during different times of the year to add to the aesthetics. But some of the other sort of practical advantages is if it's installed correctly in the beginning, like any system, it should therefore then be a lifetime roof that requires essentially no maintenance, and it's a lifetime roof you would not have to replace. So that's a big virtue. They are really good, particularly in urban areas, for stormwater mitigation. About half of all the rain that falls on a vegetated roof is absorbed by that roof. So it's good in that from that standpoint. It's really great for reducing what we call the urban heat island effect. With all the asphalt, black roofs that we typically have in urban areas, the more green roofs we have, the more that's going to cool all of the surrounding ambient temperatures. It is inherently a cool roof because it's self-shading. And the evaporation, the transpiration, evaporative sort of cooling effect that they have, it really reduces your internal cooling load in the summer. You're kind of returning habitat for the birds and the bees that a typical footprint of a building might take away. Also, it can be an extended outdoor living space, again, particularly for urban areas where we have all these flat roofs and apartment buildings. You can vegetate these roofs and have extended outdoor space. I even have some clients who are doing raised bed gardening up on their roofs. Easy to get good sun and to water. Don't have to fence it to keep the deer out. So there's if you don't have garden space on your property, then you might well have it on your roof. You can incorporate a vegetated roof all the way from almost dead flat up to about a 4 and 12 pitch without doing anything special in terms of soil retainage. But you can use some of the same techniques that like the highway department uses to prevent erosion and go all the way up to like a 12-12 pitch. So certainly it's good for new construction, but also most buildings you can retrofit with vegetated roofs as well.
Interesting. And I would guess that the species that you plant on this kind of surface, don't have a very deep root structure.
Yeah, right. If you have plants that have deeper than, let's say, 3 inches or so, then you can even put fruit trees up on your roof. But there you would have raised planters of some kind, or you can mound the soil sometimes to have greater depth. But typically, right, succulents and sedums, some wildflowers, native grasses are all options.
Okay. And when you say 20% organics, does that mean the other constituents are made of what?
Uh, there are different products out there. The one that I like to use is called Permatil, and is basically an expanded shale product. It is shale that they heat, and it kind of in a granular form, and it kind of puffs up a little bit like popcorn. So it's very lightweight and has really good drainage characteristics. But for the plants I mentioned, that's really all you really need to for good plant growth. If you use topsoil, uh, typically it's too rich. For a lot of the plants, it might sour and actually kind of die off the vegetation over time.
Okay.
So.
Gotcha. And you might have covered this, but what are the effects on insulation with a roof like this? I imagine it would be pretty good.
Well, soil is not particularly good insulator. I've already mentioned how it's good for cooling as a cool roof in the summer. In the winter, it's not so much of an insulator. Although if you do get, let's say, a snow cover, then it does create kind of a dead airspace that in that situation does add to your thermal insulating performance. But that's kind of a minor advantage of a vegetated roof. So
Gotcha.
you still need insulation.
Okay. And then I thought it'd be interesting to hear you say a few things about straw bale. I know that's one of the techniques you work with.
Right?
What can you tell us about that? Is that being used broadly? Is it rare?
Uh, it's being used a lot, actually, probably more in the Southwest than here, just because it's a drier climate. However, certainly it's adaptable to this region. I've done 6 or 8 straw bale projects in this area, and it's like any system. The details matter. The Achilles tendon of straw bale is moisture, is water. So you want to make sure that your straw is dry when you receive it, while you're storing it, and then you want to detail it so that you keep moisture out of the straw bale cavity when you're finished. So paying particular attention to all the window doors and jambs uh, is important, around the eaves, around the foundation. But there are some pretty standardized detailing for dealing with this, and it's not substantially different than conventional construction as long as you pay attention to that.
Okay.
Of course, very high thermal performance, R35 to R40. Um, the only downside, or that I can really think of in particular, is that if you're building a fairly small building, it has a bigger impact than a larger one because the walls are 20 inches to 2 foot thick. So your net interior finish space can be substantially smaller than the building footprint if you're using that. That's why on some of my projects are kind of hybrids where I use straw bale like on the north side, sometimes the east and west, but basically never on the south, where typically you would have passive solar, windows. But you use it on those wall surfaces where they're going to be coldest to your greatest advantage.
Okay. All right. And have you've got on here earth structures? Tell us a little bit about those. What might be the ideal setting for that? And I guess again, your insulation would be a huge benefit from this type of structure.
Yeah, I mean, I think earth sheltered or earth berming should be used a lot more than what it is, particularly, let's say, a region like Tornado Alley in the Midwest or wherever. Instead of having your little, shelter, ideally, I would think your whole home might want to be burned into the ground, not only in terms of wind, but also seismic. In seismic areas, they're very good. And site is important because most of your structure, at least on the lower level, is typically going to be, if not literally underground, bermed on the sides. You're going to want to point it so its openings are toward the south. So it's kind of like a thermos bottle that you're pointing toward the sun. The inside of that, you're going to let the sun in on the south side, and then with good insulation, and of course being underground, which has below frost, is going to have a constant temperature of about 55 degrees year round anyway. You're already way ahead of the game. So the additional insulation you need to have, and of course being earth sheltered like that in terms of air infiltration is well under control. So there can really be, I think, a lot of benefits for earth sheltered homes.
I guess one of the drawbacks might be you're limited on the number of windows you can have. Is that the case?
Well, yes and no. There are different designs where, again, typically you would try to point it the main openings toward the south if you can. Then there are some designs that have interior, almost like light wells or even courtyards that can come down to the interior spaces, or skylights. So there's any number of different ways to bring additional light and fresh air ventilation down into them. So, the kind of the stereotype image of dark and damp need not apply if you have a good design. Also, I actually have a project under construction right now up in Strasbourg that is an earth sheltered design. It is two-story, where the lower level is bermed in, kind of as I was describing. But the second floor, part of that is bermed, but then has a full second story of kind of normal glass windows on all sides, and even including a third-story tower that allows light to penetrate all the way from the third story all the way down to the lower level in the very center of the house, and also functions as kind of a stack or chimney effect for passive cooling, fresh air ventilation. So again, design is important when you're doing your earth sheltered structure.
Okay. And then this other approach that you mentioned here, post and beam, is that in terms of using a structural support that's sustainable rather than some kind of metal structure? Is that one of the benefits?
Yeah, I think metal can be a good alternative, but where post and beam comes into play is that typically, if you search around, you can find a local sawmill where you can have it's a locally available, renewable resource, and the cost of the materials can be extremely affordable. We're looking at, at least around my region, like $1 a board foot kind of thing for solid oak beams. And so, they're green when they come straight from the mill. And so they're heavy. But aside from that, there's really pretty simple techniques whereby you can control the rate at which they dry out, so you can minimize checking and warping. And again, the material cost can be very cheap. And I say post and beam as compared to timber frame. The only real distinction is the material is the same, except with timber frame you have a lot of mortise and tenon, manual joints that need to be made, which is labor intensive. Whereas post and beam typically is steel bracket, bolted connections. Power drill is all you need a lot of times to put these together. So that's where you can have a structure that potentially will outlast conventional frame construction by hundreds of years if it's preserved. for less material cost. And aesthetically, a lot of having all these beams exposed, a lot of people find that very desirable. So post and beam can be a very good way to go, and I do that in many houses that I design.
All right. Well, it's fascinating. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about. Well, I know there's some federal subsidies for solar, and I'm kind of focusing on Virginia because we're in Virginia, and it seems to me that Virginia state government is not exactly on the leading edge in terms of incentivizing this kind of construction. What's your take on that? And do you sometimes feel that PV gets a little more attention in terms of subsidies than some of these other approaches you use? Are they at all subsidized in any way?
Yeah, Virginia, as you mentioned, certainly is not anywhere near the cutting edge, nor is the United States for that matter in general. Most of the developed countries, particularly in Scandinavia and Europe, or even Australia, are so much further ahead than we are. By focusing on the quality of life as compared to the how much profit can be made.
Consumption.
But having said that, subsidies kind of come and go with the political climate, and it's a hard thing to keep up with. And honestly, I'm not even completely sure what may or may not be available right now at this moment. There are a lot of private companies who are actually getting into, they see a real market for doing their own internal financing for PV systems, for example. So there may be more forthcoming from the private sector than there is the government to look toward. But certainly PV is the main one on the radar. But in terms of doing things like straw bale or even post and beam or any other kind of alternative systems, building systems, I think there's very little, if anything that's out there in the way of subsidy.
Yeah. Do you find that there's kind of a psychological hill to get over in terms of people's acceptance of these different looking structures? In the public perception, we have these developments, and a lot of the houses look very similar, and people are used to buying those kind of homes and those kind of communities. Do you feel that's a little bit of what you're working against?
It is, but it is, I think, a misperception that any opportunity I have, like now, I try to inform people that the bottom line, from my perspective, is that you can incorporate all of the principles of solar, energy efficiency, healthy, non-toxic materials, affordability into virtually any style. So that's why, if you look at my portfolio, you'll see that stylistically, they run the gamut all the way from very traditional to modern. So that is kind of a misconception, along with another misconception that alternative building has to be more expensive. Traditionally in the past, I think that has been the case, but certainly that's been part of the focus of my career is making alternative, healthy, energy-efficient building not more expensive, in some cases actually less costly than conventional construction. And I'm talking about initial cost. If you factor in the life cycle maintenance and energy cost of the building, then you're going to find that in most cases, alternative building is not only a great investment, but can be less expensive than conventional construction in this day.
Well, one of the senses I get from you is that you think outside of the box. I think that's safe to say. And I would imagine that's very freeing in terms of design. And it seems to me that you're in a better position to create a space that's very suited for each individual you work with. And I noticed a comment on your site that kind of points in that direction a little bit. of course, sustainability is a huge principle you're working with, but I also sense that there's an artistic aspect to this whereby you're trying to express the person's individuality through the building. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and is that difficult to do, and how does that manifest?
Right. Again, not only can sustainable buildings take kind of any form stylistically, but certainly they can and should be adapted to the individual's occupants' needs and wishes and wants and preferences as well. So yeah, I do spend a lot of time. I feel like um, a successful project is not one that I necessarily would build for myself, but if the client is happy in the end, then I have done my job. So that's certainly a big aspect of it.
Okay. And I know.
Excuse me, I might mention one other thing about that, which is, yes, I do strive to make every design beautiful, because I think beauty is actually one of the elements of sustainability. Because if a building is beautiful and perceived as such by a lot of people, then it's much more likely to be loved and cherished and maintained over time. Whereas if it's just a kind of an ugly, cookie cutter box, it may well be kind of doomed from the beginning. So I think beauty is a sustainable principle in and of itself.
I like that. I always hear of form and function, and I like you throwing beauty in there because in nature you see form, function, and beauty, not just form and function.
You bet.
Now the trick probably becomes in that we have different perceptions of what is beautiful. So, but
well, that's where style comes into play, I think.
Yeah.
But
yeah. All right. Well, let's see. I see one header in here. I'd like to hear you talk about symbiotic living. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, symbiosis, is about the interrelationship between different forms of life on the planet, which people need to become more aware. I think includes human beings in our interrelationship with nature, and I think is the real key, way beyond sustainability, perhaps even to our own species survival, and literally avoiding extinction. That integrated interrelationship, kind of co-creative aspect of our daily lives and how we interact, I think is going to be critical, to the point where the people in the organizations that do not adapt that principle will take the course of nature, and they will not survive. And the ones who are able to create a symbiotic lifestyle will. So I think it's almost that black and white. And so, this notion of symbiosis or mutualism, where both or multiple life forms, one benefits from the other, as compared to what we are right now as a real parasite on this planet. And we need to wake up. We are in the process of killing the host. So that's really what it's all about. I think that's really the bottom line.
Yeah, I love everything you're saying there. A couple of side issues. I know they're not your primary focus, but I'd be interested to hear your perspective on them. One is sustainable transportation. As I'm hopeful we're going to transition to, you mentioned Tesla, and I'm a big fan of theirs, and I hope to see that does inspire a huge shift in terms of, transportation and how people use energy. And then also diet. because from my perspective, diet, what people put on their plate actually can cause more pollution. It does cause more pollution than transportation. So would love to hear your take on those two aspects of this.
Yeah, regarding transportation, uh, I think there are a combination of different approaches that working in tandem can really help to ease the issues we're dealing with. One is, and this is where it's a larger conversation, but the role that intentional communities can play in this. The notion, the idea of having kind of a self-maintaining, self-sustaining community that you are a part of, where perhaps not only do you live there, but everything that you need on the resources in terms of food, clothing, whatever resources you can identify are available on a local basis or a short distance away, where it minimizes your need to have an automobile, for example, or perhaps you can have a sharing situation with a smaller number of automobiles, or maybe you can bike to where you need to go. So I think that is one factor. In more of a urban area, there's concepts right now of thinking in terms of carless cities, where it's a whole new type of infrastructure where there are little pods that are available on a network where you get into your little pod and they're on some kind of a monorail system or something like that, where you key in where you want to go, and it's driverless, and it delivers you to your point of destination. Much more efficient, and less dangerous actually than automobiles. So that's yet another avenue that I would look to see happen. Certainly, like other developed countries, we should have had a coast-to-coast high-speed rail system, 20, 30 years ago, which we still not have even started in this country. And a rail system that could be powered exclusively with photovoltaics, either along the train lines themselves or even on the trains, or a combination. So there's so many different aspects that can be interrelated to try to deal with the transportation questions. In terms of food, there again, locally grown, locally consumed, intentional communities can play another part in that. And yes, the more healthy we can eat, the more better we're going to be in terms of the impact on the healthcare system in general, in a broad sense. Though I'm not a vegetarian myself, I do try to minimize my consumption of meat, because I'm very aware of the global environmental impact that industry has. So that's in vegetated roofs come back into play. I already talked about raised bed gardening up on your roof. So the closer we can come to generating all of our own produce and good organic food locally, the better off we're going to be. Local farmers markets. So that's
Beautiful.
Play.
Beautiful. Can I ask you, like in your current situation, do you use a car for transport? Do you use a gasoline-powered car? And is the current home you're living in, what kind of energy systems have you got going there?
Yeah, the home that I currently have for myself under construction, I do have a Prius, so I'm kind of going as far as I can in terms of what's currently available with that. And my own home is it's not what I would call a tiny house, but it's certainly a not so big house. In fact, I do specialize in tiny houses. However, that's I think yet another approach for dealing with a lot of these overconsumption issues that we've been talking about. But my house is organic in the sense that I have incorporated almost all of the principles that we've just been talking about. It does have a radiant floor heat. It is passive solar. The primary structure is local oak post and beam structure. It does have essentially a flat roof that will be vegetated, and I will be growing vegetables up on the roof. It has a center clear story for providing passive cooling and fresh air ventilation through the chimney effect, the stack effect. So, and my site where I'm living actually is the site of an old abandoned soapstone quarry. 100 years ago would have been considered industrial wasteland, but left alone over the last century, nature has regenerated. It's now very beautiful, spring-fed. I have it stocked with fish. They're just pet fish, but if I wanted to take it the next step and do aquaculture, it's ready and waiting for that application. So to a large extent, for the most part, I do practice what I preach.
All right, I've kind of put you on the spot there, but you totally nailed it. So lastly, could you just tell us, Fred, tell us your website, which I'll put a text in the video, but tell us the name of your website and any books or any references you'd like to share with any viewers.
Sure. My website is my name, Fred Oesch, FredOesch.com. I also have another website, which is Open World Villages, spelled out, openworldvillages.org. And that is a kind of a subsidiary organization that I put together that we do specialize. I have two other partners in that venture, and we specialize in doing master planning for both proposed and existing intentional communities. And our specialty is in tiny houses, both consulting on what's out there, what's available, what your options are, various regulatory requirements if you have an interest in doing that, and also in tiny house design and building consultation.
Okay, beautiful. Well, Fred, thank you so much for your time. It was a real pleasure, and we look forward to seeing.
Thank you. It's my honor. I invite you to come visit. You're a neighbor, so.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I'd love to see your place there. So
yeah,
perhaps we'll connect sometime. Yeah. All right.
That sounds great.